You know, in a world that always seems to be telling us to build walls for safety, what if I told you that the greatest danger actually lies inside those very walls? Today we're diving deep into one of the most counterintuitive ideas in the 48 Laws of Power, Law 18, which comes with a stark warning. Isolation is a trap. The law argues that hiding from the world doesn't protect you at all. Nope, it just makes you a prisoner, completely cut off from the vital information and allies you absolutely need to survive. So let's find out why your fortress might actually be your tomb.
Just think about that for a second. That gut reaction, when you feel threatened or just plain overwhelmed, that urge to shut the door and lock the world out is, well, it's primal, right? We all crave a sanctuary, a fortress against all the chaos. But this explainer is going to challenge that core instinct. We're going to explore this incredible paradox that in the hunt for absolute safety, we can actually become totally powerless, blind, and vulnerable to the very things we were trying to escape in the first place.
And to really see the deadly consequences of this law in action, we're going to start with a serious cautionary tale. This is the story of a man who had absolute, unquestionable power, but whose fear of losing it pushed him to build the ultimate fortress. A fortress that didn't just fail to protect him, it literally engineered his downfall.
So let me introduce you to Qin Shi Huangdi, the very first emperor to unify China. I mean, this guy was a brilliant strategist, but he was also crippled by paranoia. He built this unbelievably elaborate palace complex. We're talking 270 pavilions, all linked up by secret underground tunnels. And what was his goal? To basically become a ghost. He truly believed that if no one ever knew exactly where he was at any given moment, he would be invincible. For him, invisibility equaled invincibility. And that, my friends, was a fatal miscalculation.
So what was the real price he paid for all this paranoia? Well, by sealing himself off, the emperor effectively blinded himself. He had no access to reliable intelligence about what was happening in his own kingdom. He couldn't sense the plots that were bubbling up just outside his walls. And his fear, which was just fed by this total silence, it spiraled into this out-of-control paranoia. He became a phantom in his own empire, which ironically made him a much, much easier target for the enemies he was so desperate to avoid.
And this is where the horrifying price of his isolation becomes crystal clear. He died completely alone while he was out on a tour of his provinces. And to hide his death and stop an immediate uprising, his own ministers packed his carriage with rotting fish to cover up the stench of his decomposing body. Just think about that. The man who built an entire empire to make his name immortal had his death hidden by the smell of decay. It's such a grim, powerful symbol of how isolation will inevitably lead to ruin.
Okay, so let's pivot from the ultimate violation of this law to its most masterful observance. We're going to travel to 17th century France, to the court of King Louis XIV. Now, he faced the exact same threats as the emperor, conspiracies, rebellions, the whole shebang. But his solution was the polar opposite. Instead of hiding, he made himself the most public, most visible man in his entire kingdom.
I mean, the contrast here just couldn't be more stark, could it? On one hand, you have the emperor, a shadow ruling through fear and secrecy. On the other, you've got Louis, the Sun King, ruling through public ritual and constant presence. Where the emperor created an information vacuum, Louis turned himself into the central hub for all communication. And the results? They're a lesson in power. One died in paranoid ruin, while the other consolidated absolute authority and brought in 50 years of relative peace and stability. And this wasn't just some symbolic gesture. At his incredible palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's own bedroom was placed at the literal physical center of the entire building. The court, and really by extension the whole nation of France, literally revolved around him. He understood this masterfully. True power doesn't come from hiding out on the sidelines. It comes from commanding the center of the action.
So how in the world did he pull this off? Well, his strategy was an absolute masterclass in social engineering. First, he forced his nobles to live with him at Versailles. Then, every single moment of his day, from his public waking ceremony, known as the lever, all the way to his bedtime, became a public spectacle. Nobles would fight tooth and nail just for the honor of watching him get dressed. By keeping everyone so close, he could watch them, listen to their whispers, and control all their ambitions. They were so busy trying to win his favor that they had zero time or energy left to plot against him. See, he didn't crush his enemies. He turned them into courtiers.
Now, the stories of the emperor and the king, they aren't just ancient history. They reveal a timeless truth about the nature of power, a truth that's just as relevant in the boardroom or in our social circles today as it was back then.
Machiavelli, the great analyst of power, saw this with perfect clarity. He argued that building a physical fortress is basically an admission of weakness. It tells your people that you fear them, that you don't trust them. Real, lasting strength, he said, comes from the goodwill and the connections you build with other people. In the modern world, we'd say it like this: your network is your fortress.
And this really brings us to the core insight of Law 18. Power is a fundamentally social game. It lives and breathes through human interaction, the flow of information, and strategic alliances. So when you isolate yourself, you are voluntarily quitting the game. If you want to have any influence at all, you have to be in constant circulation, mingling, listening, and being seen. That's the arena where power is won and lost.
And you see this pattern repeated all throughout history. You look at the Roman statesman Cicero. His power was built on this incredible network of contacts across every layer of society. Or think about the French diplomat Talleyrand, who made it his business to mingle in every salon and social circle, gathering intelligence that made him absolutely indispensable. But just like with the Chinese emperor, there are cautionary tales. Let's shift from the world of politics to art and look at the tragic story of the painter Pontormo.
So Pontormo became completely obsessed with his masterpiece, a fresco in a chapel. He locked himself away for 11 years, boarding up the chapel so that nobody could see his process. He was seeking perfect, uninterrupted creation. But this total isolation didn't fuel his genius, it poisoned it. He actually died before finishing the work, and when it was finally revealed, the public was horrified. They saw it as bizarre, distorted, unsettling, the clear product of a mind that had totally lost its connection to the shared human world.
Okay, so after all of these warnings, you might be thinking the law is pretty simple. Just never be alone. But it's actually more subtle than that. Is there ever a time when retreat is the wise move? Well, this brings us to the crucial exception, the reversal of the law, understanding the massive difference between a fearful, permanent isolation and a temporary, strategic retreat.
And this distinction is everything. Destructive isolation, the bad kind, is driven by fear, and it's meant to be permanent. Its only goal is to hide. But a strategic retreat, that's totally different. It's motivated by a desire for clarity. It's temporary, and its goal is to understand. It's about stepping away from all the noise, not to escape the world, but to see it more clearly, to think and to plan your next move before you jump back in.
You see, society puts this constant pressure on us, this gravitational pull, urging us to conform, to think like everyone else. It's incredibly hard to have a truly original thought when you're constantly just reacting to what other people think. A temporary withdrawal creates that space you need for quiet reflection. It lets you find your own signal amidst all the noise, not by running away, but by intentionally seeking focus.
And here we have the ultimate proof of this principle, from the master of power himself. Machiavelli only wrote his legendary guide, The Prince, after he was politically exiled and forced into isolation on his country estate. It was this unwanted retreat, this forced distance from the game, that gave him the one-of-a-kind perspective he needed to analyze its mechanics with such brutal, timeless clarity. In his case, his isolation actually became his greatest source of power.
So this isn't just a simple command to never be alone. The real art is all in the timing. It's about knowing when you need to pull back to think and reflect, and when you need to push forward back into the crowd. So the real question is, how do you find that balance between strategic retreat and dangerous isolation in your own life?
At the end of the day, Law 18 reminds us of a fundamental truth. We are social creatures, and power is a social currency. A fortress gives you the illusion of safety, but it's a trap that blinds you to intelligence, to opportunity, and to reality itself. The greatest power and the strongest protection don't come from the walls you build to keep other people out, but from the connections you forge to bring them in.